Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government, and with three little words: we the people. We the people tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We the people are the driver. The government is the car, and we decide where it should go and by what route and how fast. Our Constitution is a document in which we the people tell the government what it is allowed to do. It seemed to me that we'd begun reversing the order of things. The government was taking more of our money, more of our options, and more of our freedom. Man is not free unless government is limited. As government expands, liberty contracts.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications.
For we are opposed by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration, on intimidation. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, its mistakes are buried, its dissenters are silenced, no expenditure is questioned, no secret is revealed.
Shadowy government with the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
You've got to be a country with a rule of law, and that rule of law has to be followed by both the people and the government for it to work. It can't just work one way and not the other.
James Baker looms very large. He has been White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State.
When I was Secretary of State, I had the view there were too many conflicting intelligence entities, and there was too much redundancy in it. Today we have 17 intelligence agencies. They're all, to some extent or another, doing the same job. It's part of the overall problem with our government. It is too big. We have too many people trying to do the same thing, and it creates a lot of confusion and a lot of bureaucratic infighting. When I left the office, I was shocked to find out that we were spending $30 billion a year on intelligence. I hate to think of what we might be spending today. And I think it could be a very healthy thing for a new administration to take a look at that.
The new secret government. Soon it was taking on covert operations, abroad and at home. The struggle required a mentality of permanent war, a perpetual state of emergency. And it meant a vast new apparatus of power that radically transformed our government. Has become a command post for covert operations run by the military, far removed from public view and congressional oversight. The powers claimed by presidents and national security have become the controlling wheel of government, driving everything else. Secrecy then makes it possible for the president to pose as the sole competent judge of what will best protect our security. Secrecy permits the White House to control what others know, and that's power.
Today, the U.S. military cost is more than the 11 other biggest militaries on Earth combined. Solution: reduce its costs by half by eliminating incompetence, redundancy, and waste, and it will still be the largest and most lethal defense force on Earth, and greater than China's and Russia's combined. This and the wars cost the citizens trillions each year, and are the main cause of the national debt. We must return to the rules in the Constitution concerning the engagement of war. It has been ignored for over 70 years. Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe, the wealthiest family in human history.
Back in 1910, the Federal Reserve System was conceived at a highly secret meeting. Who were these men? Senator Nelson Aldrich, business associate of J.P. Morgan, father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr., Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Frank Vanderlip was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the largest and the most powerful of all the banks in the country. Henry Davison, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller, he was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton, he was the president of the First National Bank of New York, which was another one of the giants. Benjamin Strong, who was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And incidentally, 3 years later, when the Federal Reserve System was finally created, he became the first head of the system. Paul Warburg, who was probably the most important of all the men there because of his knowledge of banking as it was practiced in Europe. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, one of the wealthiest men in the world. They represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And what happened on Jekyll Island is that they formed a banking cartel, and they called it the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System is not an agency of the federal government. All these years, we've had something which most people have thought was a government operation of some kind or another. We're told it was a creation to protect the people, to stabilize the economy, and it's a cartel.
The Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
So we're not a free market then?
You're quite correct. There is a central bank governing the amount of money in the system. That is not a free market.
And the purpose of a cartel is to enhance the profit structure of the members of the cartel. Period. This cartel went into partnership with the government.
The chairman typically wants to ingratiate himself into the favor of the president and often will accommodate him with loose monetary policy. The Fed, as we've seen, has the ability to extend trillions of dollars to unidentified recipients on undisclosed terms.
The government is able to borrow a tremendous amount of money and therefore spend more than it takes in taxes, but never enough. They always need more than that.
Let's say the United States needs money. Instead of issuing their own United States notes, backed by their own credit, they issue treasury bonds. They then sell these bonds to the Federal Reserve, which buys them with money they created out of thin air. The money that the Fed created then goes to the U.S. The U.S. then pays interest on the money that the Fed lent to the Treasury. So to clarify, the Fed creates money from nothing, loans that money to the U.S., and then charges interest on that money.
There is no money. There's just a checkbook. So this money springs into being precisely at the instant that the Federal Reserve officer signs the check and gives it to the government. If you and I were to do that, we would go to jail. But they can do it because Congress wants them to do it. Operating against the public interest. It encourages war.
It's not backed by gold. It's not backed by anything except people's confidence in the United States of America.
Solution. Take back from the Federal Reserve the people's constitutional right to print their own money. Then we would have no need for debt.
But the money that's created out of nothing by the banks is not spent by the banks. It's loaned by the banks to you and to me, and we pay interest on it. The government can go to the Federal Reserve and obtain instant amounts of any amount of money they want without having to confront the taxpayer and say, we're going to raise your taxes for this money directly. We got a mechanism whereby Congress has been able to raise unlimited amounts of taxes through inflation without the American people even knowing that they're paying the tax.
Today, the government is taxing us in 3 different ways, taking well over 60% of every dollar we earn. First, with income tax. Second, with sales and other taxes. Third, with harmful levels of inflation.
Inflation is a tax. The Federal Reserve and you as chairman have this authority to increase the money supply arbitrarily. You're probably the biggest taxer in the country. You're a bigger taxer than the Congress. You as a Federal Reserve chairman and the Federal Reserve Board create hundreds of billions of dollars without even appropriation process. Every time we see the cost of living going up, we indirectly are paying a tax.
Congressman, I couldn't agree with you more that inflation is a tax and that inflation currently is too high.
This is a visual representation of $10,000, $1 million, $100 million, $1 billion, and $1 trillion. There are $124 trillion in circulation in the economy. According to Forbes research, the inflation rate has been 4.9%, with hidden aspects and debt factors. For the last 16 years, the government has been borrowing and inserting into the economy an additional 4.9%, which is $6.5 trillion, exactly the federal, state, and military budgets. So they should have all that they need to operate. Solution. When the citizens have control of the printing of their money, a logical budget and reasonable levels of inflation will be established to pay all government expenses.
The tax code is a mess, and it's because of these 70,000 pages that dictate virtually every aspect of our lives and cost Americans about 6 billion hours worth of our time just to comply with. It's made the IRS a super agency involved in everything.
Politicians have discovered an income tax is a money machine. There's no group in America other than maybe lobbyists who defend this code. We have had 14,000 changes since 1986. Today you can make a change in the code. 6 months later, people may discover what actually happened. Half the lobbying in Washington revolves around this beast, and let's kill it and start all over again.
It's so incompetent that it costs the taxpayer more than $2 for the government to collect $1 of your money.
Businesses spend more than 80 hours a year on federal taxes.
You're talking about a month of work devoted not even to paying taxes, just trying to comply with the tax code, right? If you're spending time working on taxes, you're not spending time improving products, investing in your employees, expanding your business, creating jobs, which is exactly what the economy needs. Take GE, for example.
2011, according to a report, they had about 1,000 employees just doing this instead of producing light bulbs.
And that's the reason about 6 out of 10 of us pay someone else to do our taxes, because it's not only so complicated, we're afraid of making a mistake.
And you're saying that those 6 out of 10 of us could have used that money and time more creatively, might have boosted the economy, doing something useful.
Today, tax compliance employs more workers than Walmart, UPS, McDonald's, IBM, and Citigroup combined. And they produce nothing of value for the citizen.
Complex tax rules are an invitation to the ruling class to abuse its power. Our best protection is simplicity. If everyone understands the rules, it's hard to manipulate them.
Solution: eliminate income tax completely. And every taxpayer will have double their money to spend. Just printing the money that the government needs to operate is the only way to prevent those with self-centered interests from manipulating the system to their advantage and stealing from the citizens. There is no bureaucracy required, no complexity, and no ability for manipulation. It levels the playing field and is completely fair for all citizens, from a child with his piggy bank to a billionaire like President Trump.
This is just the income tax. There are all sorts of sneaky taxes that most of you may not even know about.
The government collects another few trillion in these taxes every year, and another 6.5 trillion in income tax, and yet another 6.5 trillion by expanding the money through inflation. Since the total state, federal, and military budgets for the United States are only 6.5 trillion, where is all this money going? What's wrong with this picture? Without government abuses, it has far more than it needs to operate, and no income tax is required. And without corporate tax, industry would return to America at staggering rates. This would stimulate the economy to incredible new levels, and there would be good-paying jobs for all.
Interest on the national debt is now consuming half of all of our taxes.
This is federal spending per person since America began. It started low, less than 5% of the economy. Here's World War I. Here's World War II. Used to go down after wars, but now, even in peacetime, it only goes up. Pretty soon, we're up here. How are we going to pay for that? This doesn't address the irresponsible spending that is going to bankrupt us.
In recent years, interest rates have been held at historic lows by the government and Federal Reserve to prevent a catastrophic implosion of the economy caused by their corruption and incompetence. If we don't do anything about this, it's about to get significantly worse when the interest returns to normal. According to Forbes research, the inflation rate for the last 16 years has been 5%, with hidden aspects and debt factors. Ignoring this is like being diagnosed with cancer, but you still feel okay, so you choose to do nothing. A logical solution for the elimination of the debt. The current national debt is $20 trillion, indebting every taxpayer by $263,000. Since the Federal Reserve just created the money out of nothing, simply eliminate this debt. Pension funds and Social Security can be paid out slowly over 20 years as the people retire, eliminating any immediate disruption in the economy. Mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and foreign countries slowly reduce the debt over a period of 8 years. Then inflation rates can be reduced to a healthy 4% to pay all of the government's bills, and interest rates can return to a very healthy normal of 6%, and the nation will be highly prosperous again.
Bret Stephens is a Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal.
A return to a normal interest rate. We have been too low for too long, and this has fundamentally distorted the economy in favor of investors or speculators, but against the interests of mom and pop savers. If you've had your money mainly in a checking account or in a savings account these last few years, it's been a very rough ride for you. And so to return to a normal interest rate regime will in fact favor a middle class that has taken it in the chin.
Large banks, when they get into trouble, they're going to be bailed out by the government, which means by your tax dollars and mine. Congress always rushes in and says, yes, we can't allow those bad things to happen to the people. And so they vote the money to guarantee the loans or make outright payments in some very creative fashions so that the interest can continue flowing to the banks.
In February 1995, the Clinton administration proposed sweeping changes in the nation's banking system. It would repeal several federal restrictions, including the Depression-era Glass-Steagall Act, which forbids banks from underwriting securities or selling insurance.
Dr. Greenspan, I want to start with you. You were the longest-serving chairman of the Federal Reserve in history, and during this period of time, you were perhaps the leading proponent of deregulation of our financial markets.
During Greenspan's reign, the financial sector would double its share of the economy. Companies that once sold products would now sell loans, and firms that had once worked in service to their clients would now make enormous profits trading for themselves, engineering ever more exotic financial products like derivatives, which, unlike traditional assets, were bought and sold in secret, left completely unregulated.
Mr. Greenspan, I have long been concerned that you are way out of touch with the needs of the middle class and working families of our country.
Alan Greenspan's function in life is to represent the wealthiest people in our society and the largest corporations.
According to a team at Bloomberg News, the U.S. had lent, spent, or guaranteed as much as $12.8 trillion to rescue the economy. That's trillion with a T. The Bloomberg reporters have been following that money. Bob Ivry.
You have the most powerful institutions in America lending and guaranteeing trillions of taxpayer money and not telling us why or how or where or who's getting it.
The Bush administration and the Obama administration did not want to give this information over as to how much they had helped the banks. The great injustice of the banks getting huge payouts. If you look at Bank of America, they got $45 billion in TARP money, but they got $91.4 billion from the Fed. Citigroup, $45 billion from TARP, but $99.5 billion from the Fed. They actually got twice as much money from the Federal Reserve that they got from the Treasury. So they want you to look at the Treasury money. They don't want you to look at the Fed money because that's where the real action is. Just the top 6 big banks, which are the best politically connected ones, well, they got $160 billion from TARP, but they got $460 billion from the Fed. They got 63% of the money. So if you're politically connected, you got 63% of the booty. This crash that they started, that they caused, didn't hurt them at all. It wound up helping them. Why? Because they captured the government. Those loans, in fact, wound up making them billions of dollars in free money. And we get nothing.
3 out of the 4 largest financial institutions are nearly 80% bigger than before we bailed them out because they were too big to fail.
Solution. We need to reinstate the banking laws recently lobbied away that prevent the banks from taking advantage of the American citizens' money.
You come up with Greenspeak.
Otherwise known as Fed speak, a language of purposeful obfuscation. So I proceed with 4 or 5 sentences which get increasingly obscure. The congressman thinks I answered the question and goes on to the next one.
People don't feel like these numbers are right.
I would say, the answer is I don't know. The answer is, look,
I don't know how to, we could have, I know that, in the conspiracy world, theory-driven world in which we live in, you connect data points. I mean, you can go on and trace it, but listen, it's necessary for us to do that. I don't know how to, I'm not sure how to respond to that. People say that. I think, look at it's something, frankly,
the last few years of Congress have been the most unproductive ever.
Yeah. Both parties have told newly elected members of the Congress that they should spend 30 hours a week in the Republican and Democratic call centers dialing for dollars. That's a lot of telemarketing, probably more than most telemarketers do. It's discouraging good people from running for public office.
As a sitting member of Congress, your first responsibility is to make sure you hit $18,000 a day. Cold calling a list that fundraisers put in front of you. A cult-like boiler room on Capitol Hill. It's shameful. It's beneath the dignity of the office that our voters and our communities entrust us to serve.
That's more time calling and asking for money than constituent work or floor work in Congress.
The incompetent minds that got us into these messes are not qualified to get us out of them.
Inspector Coleman, you're the Inspector General for the Federal Reserve, right? Okay.
That's correct.
Well, I have a copy of the Inspector General Act here in front of me, and it says, among other things, that it's your responsibility to conduct and supervise audits and investigations relating to the programs and operations of your agency.
That's correct.
So I'm asking you if your agency has, in fact, according to Bloomberg, extended $9 trillion in credit, which, by the way, works out to $30,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. I'd like to know, if you're not responsible for investigating that, who is?
In terms of who's responsible for investigating, would you mind repeating the question one more time?
My question to you specifically is, do you know who received that $1 trillion plus that the Fed extended and put on its balance sheet since last September? Do you know the identity of the recipients?
I do not know.
So are you telling me that nobody at the Federal Reserve is keeping track on a regular basis of the losses that it incurs on what is now a $2 trillion portfolio?
I don't know.
A lot of people think that the president of the New York Fed works for the U.S. government, but in fact you work for the private banks that elected you. The people don't elect you, it's the individuals who sit on the board of the New York Fed that elect you. Is that correct?
It's slightly more complicated than that.
On derivatives, yeah, I think they were wrong, and I think I was wrong to take it.
And my question for you is simple. Were you wrong? Your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. That's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I had been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well.
You mentioned that there was a very large amount of money that could not be accounted for in the Pentagon. They spend about half of all the money we vote to spend in the Congress. And we don't spend 1% of our time in the Congress talking about this expenditure.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat. More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
20 years ago, Pentagon employee Franklin C. Spinney made headlines exposing what he calls the accounting games. He believes the problem has gotten worse.
Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Ian Bremmer is the president of the Eurasia Group, a global political risk consultancy.
In a world where leadership from politicians is seen as lacking and lacking in trust, that we're going to find new leaders. It'll be, sort of individuals that people haven't heard of before that are going to capture the imagination, they're going to inspire, and they're going to make a difference. Some will be private sector, some will be public intellectuals. It makes much more of a difference than the traditional organizations and institutions that we feel constrained by.
Because we're a great nation, our challenges seem complex. It will always be this way.
But as long as we remember our first principles and believe in ourselves, the future will always be ours. And something else we learned. Once you begin a great movement, there's no telling where it'll end.
It is now time once again for the American citizens to take charge of their own destiny. The Council for American Citizens, providing an alternative to the existing Washington dysfunction and corruption by gathering the brightest minds available today. From a cross-section of society's most important professions, organizations representing farming, energy, transportation, education, banking, the arts, law, and many others are being contacted to submit their choices from the most accomplished amongst their peers to create a well-rounded, general, cumulative, super-intelligent council to guide the President and Congress on all topics affecting the welfare of the people. Please join us and become a part of this noble effort to return America to the land of great prosperity our founding fathers envisioned for us.